Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I interview founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, amazing people all around the world. And we are kicking off 2025 with a bang. I have a slew of new podcasts for you this year. Looking forward to an excellent year. And today I have another amazing guest. He is the CEO and founder of ZkCloud, and I wrote his name down. His first name is Teemu. His last name is Päivinen. I hope I did a good job with that. Teemu, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And sorry for the difficult to pronounce last name.
Oh, it's okay. I've had some wonderful guests with crazy last names that are great. It's been an adventure. So I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to kick things off. And I asked all my guests the same question to kick things off, and that's, what is your background, and is it a logical background for what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I mean, I've been an entrepreneur in the blockchain space since about 2012. I started like an early Bitcoin exchange in college here in Europe. Did that for a little while. I have, over the years, I've bounced around quite a lot in different projects, as an investor or an advisor or operator. Um, I was back in, I think it was like 2017. I was helping the Dapper Labs guys launch CryptoKitties and working with Open Zeppelin when this is pretty early days for them. But for those who are not familiar, Open Zeppelin is like the standard smart contract library. And then now they've built all kinds of other stuff around that. And then 2018, I started a company called Equilibrium, which is now called Equilibrium Group, which basically focuses on low-level protocol development. So we work with most of the big foundations and projects in general, from like Starkware and Celestia and ZK Sync to sort of L1s like Solana Foundation, Ethereum Foundation, and so on. So we sort of, or Equilibrium Group sort of focuses on building the blockchains themselves, if that makes sense, as opposed to applications. And Gevulot, which is now ZkCloud, and the network is called ZkCloud. Gevulot is the company, was spun out of Equilibrium. So I did that for, how many years does that make it? Like 6 years. Ran that company, and then decided to spin myself out to focus on making ZK proving really economically efficient.
Excellent, excellent. So, CryptoKitties, huh? You worked on rolling that out. I have interesting
Back in the day.
day. I had a client that I recommended the CryptoKitties approach, ERC 721, to, and it was back in 2018. And their lawyer was like, "Get out of our building," and out. And I'm like, "But it's going to work for your solution," So, um, early days. So,
Yeah, I mean, that was a great time in some ways because, back then NFTs were not a thing, like, at all. And in fact, I still think CryptoKitties was one of the more interesting ways that NFTs have been done. They weren't just, a picture or anything. There was a whole evolutionary algorithm for how to breed your cats and so on. Um, but my most cherished memory of that is just telling people before CryptoKitties launched about CryptoKitties. I was like, listen, cats on the blockchain, it's going to be big. Internet loves cats. And people just think I'm insane.
they do they do love cats. There have been a few projects that since then that have but I want to find out, ZkCloud, what it's about, what makes your offerings unique in the node rental space, right?
Yeah, well, so ZK is well, we call it a universal proving layer. So basically, it's a prover network, or a generalized prover network for computing proofs for things like zero knowledge rollups or coprocessors, things like that. Um, so let's say, Scroll needs to generate X amount of proofs. They have basically like they can, you know, run the prover themselves on something like AWS or sort out the machines, or they can use ZkCloud and kind of offload that to a decentralized system. And so that's really that's its usability. The point of it, or the reason that it is important, I think, is because by collecting hardware from across the globe with incentives, kind of like how Bitcoin mining works, it really functions as this sort of optimal search algorithm for the cheapest possible hardware, cheapest possible bandwidth, etc. And so we can drive down the costs of ZK proving quite considerably, as compared to something like AWS, 95% cheaper or something like that. And that in turn means that ZK rollups and other ZK applications are more efficient for the end user. So whatever costs there are improving basically just get rolled to the end user in terms of transaction fees. And so this is one way of making ZK rollups just more competitive in the landscape of L2s. So yeah, that's kind of the main point.
Got it. It's interesting. I was consensus at that. I mean, 8 months in this industry is like a eternal time, right? So I'm a consensus at the end of May, and everybody's talking about how ZK is the next $1 trillion opportunity. And then I talked to some people in Ethereum recently and said, we hope Ethereum survives the current market situation. I'm like, how'd you go from the $1 trillion opportunity to the hopes of survival? Like, what is the disconnect? Why are we not achieving that $1 trillion ZK opportunity right now? And what opportunities are there still out there to be able to get to that $1 trillion opportunity?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that stems from the fact that, narratives kind of fluctuate constantly. People are bullish, bearish all the time. It sort of changes constantly. ZK, the technology, is on like a pretty straightforward trend where it's constantly improving. So if you look at, for example, what's happening in academia, like ZK is constantly getting better in terms of performance and cost and so on. So I think the underlying technology, nothing about it has really changed in the past year. In fact, maybe you could argue that we got it quite a lot sooner. So if you remember Vitalik, when he like first started talking about the L2 roadmap and optimistic rollups and ZK rollups, his view was that we would get optimistic rollups, and then like a couple years later, maybe we would get ZK rollups. And actually, we got everything kind of very close to each other, right? We got optimistic rollups like a tiny bit earlier, but then we got ZK rollups. And so I think it's like been accelerating, if anything, on a technology level. But then there is this the issue is essentially that it is still slow. Like ZK is kind of like the only way we're actually going to scale the L1 indefinitely. But in order to do that, we need to still improve performance quite a lot from here. And so I think that's sort of where the narrative goes. So there's a lot of expectations built up for the launch of the ZK rollups, but the ZK rollups are not actually that's not yet the way we fully scale Ethereum. Like it's still nascent and it's going to take a little while, and the technology needs to improve more. But I think that's changing. Like the narrative is kind of shifting again. Now Ethereum is maybe kind of for the first time putting like a lot of the Ethereum Foundation and the different projects are like really focused on getting proving times to be very short, and so that we could theoretically prove the Ethereum L1 blockchain itself. And I think that's a great goal. But yeah, so I mean, like that in terms of like a goal for the industry or the ZK industry to meet, it hasn't been as clear before. Now it's very clear. Like we need to be able to prove Ethereum blocks within the Ethereum block time, and that allows us to sort of truly scale the Ethereum L1. And I think part of this comes from the fact that people have started to realize that if we're fully reliant on optimistic rollups that sort of function as their own ecosystem, then actually we're not really scaling L1. We're just moving people from Ethereum to Arbitrum, which is fine to an extent. But at some point we want the Ethereum ecosystem to be much bigger than what it is now. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I guess the TLDR is that the narratives change every day and the technology keeps going.
And people will have a tendency to condense the narrative with the technology and roll it all together into one. And like, and the question is, how do you help people separate the two?
Yeah, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I would be a very rich man, I think. Like I still haven't figured out how to, like, even parsing signal from noise for me, like having been in the industry for such a long time, is still a struggle. So I would imagine it is for a lot of people.
Yeah. So let's talk about, you said improvements. So you are looking to achieve centralized equivalent pricing performance for a decentralized system, right? How is that
Yeah.
possible to achieve it?
Yeah. So the nice thing about ZK is that you don't need to do re-execution. So like every blockchain basically functions on the same principle, where every server, validator, full node, whatever in those networks computes the exact same thing again and again and again, right? So if you have 10,000 full nodes, then you're doing the same computation 10,000 times. And they basically do that to make sure that, some other guy did it correctly. The magic of ZK is that you can get that assurance that some other guy did it correctly without computing it again. And so we can generate proofs on a single machine, and then the other entities don't need to participate. And so if you think about the cost structure of something like a blockchain, normally it really stems from that reason. You're just doing unnecessary work in huge amounts constantly. With ZK, you don't need to do that. And so you can achieve I mean, that's part of the cost structure. The other part is just like the hardware to be used. And here I think a decentralized system is actually superior to centralized solutions. So what I was talking about earlier, finding the cheapest hardware from around the world, like the Bitcoin miners are very innovative, much more innovative than any single company would be. They'll find some, dam or something somewhere in the middle of nowhere where electricity is free, and then they'll mine there. And so we want to bring that same kind of dynamic to proving. So yeah, it's kind of like those two things. In terms of performance, being decentralized isn't a constraint because you're only generating the proof essentially on one machine or one cluster. You don't need to do the same thing in every single node in your network. And then in terms of cost, you just like have incentives to find the cheapest possible cost structure that's available in the world.
Interesting. I forget sometimes because I've been in it so long that Bitcoin miners are using, like they use volcanoes, they use tsunamis, they use all kinds of stuff, so
They're
that,
very opportunistic folks.
yeah.
and very good at finding it, those opportunities. Like, and there's no way, like, if I was to hire a team and I was like, find me the cheapest options for like, running some kind of data center, it's just impossible for them to actually find the cheapest options all over the world. Like, there's just logistically it doesn't work. What you need is like many different companies in many different parts of the world who have a better understanding of what's available locally, to then sort of utilize those things and bring them online into a network without needing permission or kind of like top down direction.
Interesting. So we want to make, as far as ZK, you want to make ZK proofs faster and more scalable, right? How do you do that?
Yeah, so I mean, ZK proofs will get faster without us doing anything. Academia, like I said, is progressing very quickly. Um, there's constantly innovation both on the hardware side of things as well as on the software side. So like the the prover implementations are getting better. There's all kinds of like there's better hardware coming from, you know, big companies like Nvidia, and then smaller companies like Fabric that's doing custom chips for doing ZK proving, and so on. And so I think like ZK getting faster is like an inevitability. Like it's just gonna happen. And what we want to do is just to provide like the place where this can all of that innovation can basically like be brought to market. So we'll kind of like connecting the hardware and the software supply in a sense. And our but we're in terms of where like our thinking for our competitive dynamic with centralized providers, like let's say the traditional cloud providers, we're more focused on being cheaper. Like the hardware will generally be like anyone can kind of buy an NVIDIA GPU. There's going to be a limit to how much better your hardware can be than the next guy. But what is very hard to do on sort of an individual basis is get to sufficient scale where you can really bring down the cost. And like said, you know, all the other elements of the location where like, you know, your electricity and your bandwidth and whatnot. So we want to drive down the costs of proving to basically zero, which then opens up all kinds of possibilities for the types of use cases that are economically viable. And then the technology will sort of improve by itself by the efforts of all the people in academia and these great projects like Starkware and ZkSync and so on.
Awesome. I think NVIDIA just released or made an announcement. They released a new supercomputer. It's like yesterday or to this morning.
I
Uh,
don't know. I watched it afterwards, so I don't know when it was. But yeah, they also announced this thing called Digits, which is like a Mac Mini size thing that has an insane amount of compute. And so our team has been all you know, going a little bit insane. We're like, maybe we should just order like, you know, 1,000 of these things. Because I think it will. So there's ZkCloud. It's potentially very interesting for us because it potentially means that almost any normal person, if they just have a good enough internet connection, could run like a ZkCloud proving cluster in their, you know, bedroom. Um, that's cool, and the cost structure of that is insanely low. It's like the same as a GPU. Um, and then, you know, all the other elements of it, like, you know, everyone has access to enough compute to run big AI models, all this stuff. Like I think I'm very enthusiastic about this future where you know, it would be commonplace to have enough compute that you can run a local AI model. I think the current direction of AI, where we all sort of give all of our data to OpenAI and a couple other companies, is a bit concerning. Doesn't fit very neatly with my sort of, you know, crypto libertarian whatever ideology.
me either. So, I agree with you. It'd be great if we have it local. Um, so we're talking about adoption, right? We're talking about if you could do it locally, you're gonna have more adoption, right? So I want to find out how ZKs and will pave the way for greater adoption. And that's the thing everybody keeps talking about is get more people involved. We're in the next billion. Well, I've heard it for years, but I haven't seen it. So,
Yeah.
how do you achieve it? You know?
Um, I think this is another one of those things where if I had all the answers, I'd be a very rich man. But uh, so like, well, one thing to maybe know is I'm not sure ZK, the technology is like that's not really the user facing thing. Like, you know, Joe Schmo on the street doesn't care whether it's ZK or something else. Um, It's more about what it makes possible. Like I think ultimately always adoption in every cycle so far comes from there being something that, more and more people want to do that just exists on chain, either because it's only possible to do on chain, sometimes just because it happens to be on chain. I'm kind of indifferent to which one pulls in adoption. Um, but I think that's always where it comes from. So it's use cases, things like that. But we already have use cases which are driving huge amounts of adoption. The one I like to point to, which now is like pretty self-evident for everyone, but at some point wasn't as clear, is like I think we have actual strong product market fit in payments. Um, which is funny because we were talking about this back in, when it was just Bitcoin. Everyone was like, oh, payments are going to be big. And it's like, well, it took 10 years, but whatever. Um, and I think payments have like a lot of interesting dynamics that that ZK will help accelerate. So there's sort of some payments need to be really fast, but the thing with payments in general is that there's just like if we actually want to onboard like all payments, that's a lot of payments. There is no L1, no chain that is able to handle that kind of volume. I suspect even theoretically it is impossible. And so we need to scale capacity to a point which we don't fully understand yet. So I'm maybe like not that focused on like what exactly is going to do what in this, year or this cycle. It's more like in order for us to like win the long-term game, we need to be able to actually handle capacity, not just on the level of like a Visa or a MasterCard, but in terms of like what all kinds of monetary transactions happen in the traditional system in general. And it's a huge amount. And I don't think there's any other way to really scale to that point besides ZK. We can sacrifice on decentralization, of course, but then we kind of like it kind of defeats the purpose of the effort in the first place. So I think sort of maybe I could sum it up as like I even with just this one use case, like adoption will increase on a on some time horizon. Obviously, markets will do what they do, but it will continuously generate new use cases and more adoption. And so we will need more capacity, and we do need that technology to be there. So this is sort of a little bit of a side topic, but I think it's sort of fascinating that in like every previous cycle before now, Ethereum was full. Like that was the problem. Like the big problem of crypto was basically we couldn't fit any more transactions into Ethereum. Gas fees skyrocketed. People were paying $500 in transaction fees for doing a DEX swap and things like that. That problem has now gone away, which is interesting. And now people are switching from the panic of like, oh no, we need to scale to oh no, where's adoption coming from? And that all makes sense, and that's sort of the way that it should go. But it is always worth bearing in mind that these things flip pretty easily. And things take time, like payment adoption, especially where it seems like a lot of it is going to be coming from, like different payments companies using blockchain rails under the hood. Like that's just sort of integration work that doesn't happen overnight. And if I'm, I don't know, PayPal or something, I don't want to just like have someone build something and be like, I'm sure it's great and turn it on. Like I want to move really slowly and make sure it all works. So yeah, like in terms of the ZK industry, I guess mostly ZK rollups. I think where adoption comes from is simply just like there will be more demand, and regardless of what chain it ends up being on, at some point you need to scale it beyond what like an L1 can handle, and then you need to have ZK working.
All right, so let me ask you this. And in the traditional payments world, because I'm on calls every month regarding that, people are like, who's going to be the winner? PayPal, Circle, who's going to be like, who's going to like Venmo, who's going to be the ultimate winner, the TradFi world? And I'm like, if there's more capacity than there are chains to handle that capacity, would ZK be able to be a tool to not just be for Ethereum, but could you cross pollinate different payment so that Litecoin could handle a section, Bitcoin could handle something, Ethereum could handle other areas of payments, and ZK be the facilitating technology that ties it all together and then achieves and be able to meet that capacity globally?
Um, yeah. So I think for any kind of, I mean, there's a lot of caveats. So this is going to be a dramatic simplification, and everyone should take it with a slight grain of salt. Um, but in general, I think for interoperability across different environments, ZK is far and away the best way to do it. So like if you look at how bridges are structured, they're generally, multi-sigs essentially between L1s, which makes sense because there's not really any natural way for them to talk to each other. They could with ZK. That probably requires quite a lot of work, and it's unclear if it makes sense to do that. But where this will be very evident much sooner is between ZK rollups. So interoperability between ZK rollups is like a very natural thing that's already being worked on by the ZK Sync guys on Elastic Chain and so on. And the reason that it's ZK specifically and not optimistic is because optimistic structures have this like I don't know what they are exactly now, but like many days withdrawal window. I think it's like 5 or 7 days withdrawal window. Which means if you're moving between these things, you're either trusting a centralized counterparty to basically just do the bridge, um, or you're waiting for 7 days, so that it can actually sort of like move. And that's a big problem. And there's various other problems relating to this, like what happens if Ethereum has a reorg. Ethereum sometimes just decides like, actually, all these blocks were a bit wrong. We're going to change them. And this happens every now and then. And if you've had all these like 7-day withdrawal window cross optimistic rollup transactions happen, it gets very messy. ZK has the benefit of once the proof has been computed, I mean, you can still have a reorg, but the proof itself will end up in some block and it's valid or not. And you don't need to wait. Like in theory, we could be posting, and this is what the Ethereum Foundation wants to do. We could be posting proofs to Ethereum L1, or the rollups could be posting proofs every block. So it would be sort of the same, like your in technical terms, it's like finality would be the same as Ethereum L1. And then of course the rollup itself could give you pre-confirmations much faster. So I think so. The exact way that happens, I've learned to like not try to predict too much, because oftentimes, even if sort of conceptually I'm correct about what happens in the future, the actual shape of it ends up being quite different than I was anticipating. Um, but I fully do think that like there's going to be specific chains which a lot of these companies and other providers start using for conducting payments, and they will get blocked up at some point. Like it's so much cheaper than the traditional financial world, which is fascinating in itself. Like, how can it be cheaper? Like, it's more an indictment on the traditional world than anything else, because theoretically the traditional world should be quite cheap. But yeah, everyone's going to start doing it just because they can save, whatever, hundreds of millions by doing it. So it was just, I think Stripe was just talking about it. Like if they can cut, you know, they pay like 3% to the payment providers or something like that. If they can cut like 1.5% out of that with their volume, that's like huge. So it's going to happen, and then we'll need to come back to the scaling thing. And I foresee that eventually have the same discussion where we're like, oh no, now we need to scale again. And we continue this loop.
Very cool. Very cool. So my last question was going to be about predictions. Um, you know, and you said you don't like predictions, but 2025. I think we're, except for the past couple of days where we had a pullback. Something happened, whatever happened. What do you see as, crystal ball? What do you see is coming down the pipe for 2025? Does retail return? Like, what happens this year?
Well, can I ask you a quick question before I go into that? What do you think retail is not here?
You know, it looks different than it did during the FTX prime days, right? And you
Yeah.
had stadiums with the names FTX on. You had a lot of retail jumping in. You had 13 Super Bowl commercials about the metaverse during the Super Bowl a few years ago. It's not, are they here? Yeah, silently, I think,
Mm.
but I think the hype's gone.
Yeah, it's interesting. So uh, on the podcast we recorded with two of my friends, we talked about this, and I think the tell for when retail arrives is usually that the buying is indiscriminate, i.e., everything goes up or everything goes down, and up until late last year, it was not the case that everything was going up. It was only very specific things that would have run ups. But then there were many things that were just flat since the previous bull market, and so on. I think that has changed, but it is early. And so I feel like retail is here more, in random interactions with normal people or people who are not in crypto. Um, Crypto comes up way more now than it did, even a couple months ago. Um, but it does seem like there's not as much madness, and what I found really interesting to think about is like there's also not anything that's very obvious that would be the reason that like everything goes to crashes again. Like there's not like a clear Luna, or there's not like anywhere where there's incredible amounts of leverage that could unwind very rapidly, with maybe the exception of MicroStrategy. So I don't know. It feels to me like it's early innings of a bull market, but it's really hard to tell uh because we're in a non-zero interest rate environment basically for the first time. And so we'll see how that impacts things. I think if I was going to make a prediction, is if the bull market sort of keeps getting crazier from here, then the entire world will need to get involved, because the only argument left is that it's a zero interest rate sort of phenomenon, and it's going to just crash when interest rates go up. If the cycle continues, even with positive interest rates, then it becomes like the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that you just can't avoid. But on a more practical level, I think we'll start to see like the big change that happened, I think, last year, that will play out this year, is that I think it will become normalized that investors from the traditional world, corporate treasuries, etc., hold exposure, probably primarily to Bitcoin, but I think they'll want some exposure in other things as well. And so that I think is pretty obvious. Beyond that, I don't like. If I had to predict what is going to drive retail, right now from where I'm sitting, I think AI agents. Um, I don't know. Like we can debate the merits of chatbots with meme coins, but I follow a bunch of these chatbots. I think it's very interesting. And I like, it feels like a little bit it feels similar to things like the ICOs or NFTs being kind of the driver of demand, except I think there's a bit of a difference because the AI agents are actually building up an audience, and that audience has fundamental value that will, remain even after the markets change. And so I think that's like an interesting dynamic that will play out. It's like I don't think there's any kind of business model for all this stuff yet, but it does feel like that's maybe the thing that will be kind of interesting and exciting for a large amount of people to come and do something, you know.
Right. I'm excited about what's going to be this year. This will be awesome. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. I enjoyed speaking with you and learned a lot. And I have one last question, really. It's how can people find out more information about you, about ZkCloud? How can they do that? How can they, you know, reach out? How can they do that?
Well, I mean, I'm on Twitter /X, as is ZkCloud. So ZkCloud is at the ZkCloud, and I'm at Teemu PAI. You'll I'm sure find me with that. If you type anything even mildly resembling my name, there's not that many people, so it should be there. Then if you wanted to learn more, zkcloud.com is the website that has all the information. And yeah, I mean, you should, join us and chatting about this stuff on Telegram or Discord.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.